Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Habibis, what's going on? It is Siraj Hashmi, and this is Keeping It Halal for Tuesday, June 30th, 2020. Gonna get into a few quick stories real quick. God, what's wrong with me? Um, I, just before we get into a lot of the thick stories today, thick with three C's, um, obviously a few things going on. First of all, Carl Reiner, the legendary comic, creator of the Dick Van Dyke Show, partner with Mel Brooks, died at 98 years old today, or at least it was announced he died. Um, Guy was a legend in the sense that he created the infrastructure for a lot of comics to succeed. He had obviously Dick Van Dyke, Mel Brooks, um, countless of others. Obviously, his son Rob Reiner became a pretty successful film director, and obviously, uh, rest in peace to Carl Reiner, and condolences to his family and friends and everyone mourning him. Um, but a lot of news happening this week. First of all, off the top, we got this Russia Taliban bounty program that's currently being reported on. If you're not familiar with what's going on, essentially, it's a giant clusterfuck. I really can't tell you exactly who knows what and when they knew it. Um, but the New York Times essentially reported that basically in March, President Trump was, according to an anonymous source, President Trump was briefed by the intelligence community that Russia, at least one of their military intelligence units, uh, the GRU, for those who aren't familiar, just one of their units, started a bounty program and incentivized Taliban linked insurgents or militants in Afghanistan to kill U.S. service members, American soldiers, NATO personnel. So we're talking about Americans, Brits, anyone who's really part of NATO who's in Afghanistan. They have bounty contracts on their heads, and essentially, money was exchanged from Russians, this Russian intelligence unit, to these Taliban linked militants who could prove that they killed particular U.S. service members. And then the Washington Post followed up saying that essentially there were a number of U.S. service members and NATO personnel who died or were killed. They were killed as a result of this particular bounty program. Now, members of Congress are trying to figure out what happened and who knew what. And President Trump sort of boxed himself into a corner here. Instead of sort of just, he did deny that these intelligence reports were ever briefed to him, but he specifically said that the threats were not verifiable or they weren't credible enough to essentially move forward on it. So now the question is, did Trump know that this was happening back in 2019? According to some sources, I think John Bolton is one of them, the former national security advisor, allegedly briefed President Trump in 2019 about this Russia Taliban bounty program. And it sounds like Trump either sat on his hands or he didn't know about it. So it's kind of two possibilities here. He had privileged information, and that hasn't really been sorted out. I will say this though, because this happened, this a particular leak is being sourced to like March of 2020. This is when the coronavirus pandemic was declared. And basically, the United States and the public health departments were mobilizing to basically contain the spread of coronavirus. This kind of is a good chance that this story probably wouldn't have received as much oxygen in March. And if that actually happened, it probably would. So there's some questions about the validity of this particular leak. Did it actually happen, and that Trump was briefed on it? And if not, why is it coming out now? So, coronavirus is back on the rise again, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But essentially, you always have to wonder about the timing of certain things. Why is this coming out right now? If we were sitting on this information for 3 months, why is a source only leaking it to the New York Times and the Washington Post now? Just gotta wonder. I mean, these are valid questions, because if the intelligence community is trying to legitimately protect the homeland, the United States, all of its allies as well, in conjunction with the intelligence communities of other countries, our allies, um, certainly they would probably try to push this out sooner. I mean, think about the U.S. Taliban deal that was made in February, and the incentive for Trump to keep that deal. Um, of course, there are a few service members who were killed earlier this year, but it wasn't after. It happened before the peace deal was inked in February. So just take that with a grain of salt. There's still more to come. We still don't know all the answers. Um, but a couple of other interesting stories. First of all, I mean, the next one I'm going to get to. Um, the Islamic Republic of Iran essentially issued a warrant against President Trump and 35 others for assassinating Qasem Soleimani in January of 2020. Um, we should have known how crazy this year would have been had we known just how crazy it started off with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, which is part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC. I almost said Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's incorrect. Um, and I would have obviously showed my my ignorance on that one. But uh, it's kind of funny. It's like basically uh, the Iranian regime was like flagging Interpol and just being like, "Hey, if you ever get a chance, can y'all arrest Trump for us? Appreciate it. Salute." It's just so ridiculous to think that Interpol is actually going to come through to the White House and the West Wing and uh, give Trump the perp walk, and like Ayatollah Khamenei and like Iranian President Hassan Rouhani are just like escorting him out of the West Wing, and the resistance just being like, "We finally fucking got him." Just it's just an amazing visual to think of. I mean, you recall back when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated um, through a drone strike in Iraq, following the uh, essentially the organized attack of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Um, that essentially Soleimani left himself exposed, and he has been mourned by the Iranian regime ever since. Um, and yeah, that's been a wild story. It's kind of funny to think that um, the Iranians can get away with that. Um, On to another story, which certainly affects me a little bit more as a sports fan, particularly as a New England Patriots fan. Uh, the Patriots signed Cam Newton to a very team friendly deal, a 1 year deal, like the veteran minimum. Think about how long Cam Newton has been in the league. He got released by Carolina, played in the Super Bowl for them, won the 2015 NFL MVP. Phenomenal player, got hampered by injuries, and then he gets cut, and Teddy Bridgewater essentially fills the void, coming from New Orleans after Tom Brady leaves the Patriots. So think about that. Cam Newton succeeding Tom Brady with a legendary coach in Bill Belichick. I can't think of a better way for Cam Newton to sort of make that comeback, and I'm really excited to see him do it. Also, interesting timing, considering that the news of Cam Newton signing happened on the same day or within hours of the NFL slapping the Patriots with a penalty and fining them and stripping them of a draft pick for their videotaping of the Cincinnati Bengals sideline in the previous season. I don't know if we'll get a season this year, but you can imagine, obviously, from a PR standpoint, that I think the Patriots were waiting for that penalty to come down, to just be like, "Yep, we're gonna sign Cam Newton," because that's completely taking all the oxygen out of the room on just focusing on the Patriots getting penalized. And so it obviously doesn't take an idiot to see that, or it doesn't take a rocket scientist, I should say, to see why the announcement came out when it did. I'm pretty sure Cam Newton probably had been working with the Patriots for a little bit longer, or at least been in talks with the Patriots. Um, I couldn't see the signing happen unless it was a team friendly deal, and this is a very team friendly deal. Patriots did not have the cap space to simply pay him, so he's based on the vet minimum in the 2020 vet minimum, between an 8 and 9 year veteran, which I believe Cam Newton is around. That's just around 800 $900,000. Not very much. It's apparently incentive laden. It's late. It's There's so many incentives in it, I guess, based on performance. And if he ends up getting the starting job, you can imagine how crazy the NFL season would be. I would certainly welcome it. Moving on, focusing on coronavirus, there's been a surge recently. We're looking at a second wave. Some people are talking about it being the first wave. Andrew Cuomo, the New York governor, looking at how this, he rolls out this.
This, you know what this is? This is the mountain. What is the tallest mountain in the state of New York? Mount Marcy. This is the mountain that New Yorkers climb. You know, I keep showing the curve. This is the curve. It's actually proportionate. We started on day one, and the numbers kept going straight up for 42 days.
When you look at that, you think we're like, what is this, a fifth grade science fair? I mean, come on. This is a giant mountain that somebody took the time to sculpt to make Governor Andrew Cuomo look good. And I mean, before we talk about Cuomo in more detail, I mean, we're talking about, there has been obviously numbers of coronavirus cases and deaths are at almost the lowest it's been since March. But there's obviously a couple of things that don't strike me as sound. I mean, they strike me as weird. For one, according to the city, which is the publication, in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio's test and trace campaign said they won't be asking anyone who's tested positive for coronavirus if they've recently attended a demonstration. And look, there are certainly a lot of things to worry about coronavirus, considering that New York was the biggest hot spot for coronavirus. And essentially, when we think about how this all got so bad, you have to look at how Governor Cuomo handled it. And he did a really piss poor job in handling it, but was getting fawned over by the media. And now that things are simmering down in New York, he's getting that positive press coverage. And I feel like we can't let it go by and ignore the fact that, regardless of how President Trump has handled it throughout the country, certainly within New York, Cuomo had a lot of his own missteps, and that led to a lot of people unnecessarily dying. And it looks like he might get away unscathed with the blood of nearly 6,000 people on his hands. And it all happened from an executive order that he issued on March 25th, stating that nursing homes, quote, must comply with the expedited receipt of residents, end quote, coming from hospitals, regardless of whether they were infected with coronavirus. The CDC warned that nursing homes need to keep coronavirus out of their facilities unless they were properly able to care for them. And that was a directive that they issued 2 days before. So we're talking March 23rd. March 23rd for the CDC, March 25th for Cuomo. And when he was asked about this, when Cuomo was asked about these nursing home deaths and how things got so bad in nursing homes, who did he blame? Trump, of course. And in a May 20th presser, Cuomo said in response to a reporter's question about his executive order, saying, quote, "I'm not going to get into the political back and forth, but anyone who wants to ask, why did the state do that with COVID patients in nursing homes? It's because the state followed President Trump's guidance. So they should ask President Trump," end quote. Now, this is a claim that PolitiFact, who has received a lot of criticism for its left-leaning bias, they deemed this as mostly false. And only a degree further than that would have been pants on fire, basically, straight up lie. But this is, I mean, I don't know how you get into the gradients here. It is certain. If it's mostly false, it's still false, and it's in essence Cuomo's lying and trying to save face. The two key factors that the CDC cited to consider whether to discharge patients to a long-term care facility. So we're talking about nursing homes, we're talking about adult care facilities, these extended care facilities. One, that first factor is the patient medically ready for discharge to a long-term care facility? And two, is the selected long-term care facility able to safely care for a patient recovering from the virus by implementing all recommended infection control procedures? Obviously, we have no idea how many nursing homes were able to actually fulfill that order. But after Cuomo rescinded that executive order, basically issuing another executive order saying that, clarifying that May 25th order, basically saying, trying to scrap that whole thing under the rug, saying that, nursing homes can't accept COVID-19 patients. Essentially, Cuomo did this to free up space in the hospitals. And if you recall, the ship, the Comfort, that came up from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way up to New York City, that was used obviously for healthcare and essentially coronavirus when things got really bad. But Cuomo did this to save up hospital space for seriously ill coronavirus patients. And the reality is that nursing homes felt pressured to accept coronavirus patients after Cuomo's March 25th executive order. The AMDA, the Society for Post-Acute and Long-Term Care Medicine, they opposed the order, saying that it was, quote, overreaching, not consistent with science, unenforceable, and beyond all, not in the least consistent with patient safety principles, end quote. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, long-term care facilities account for this was reported yesterday. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, coronavirus cases in long-term care facilities accounted for only 14% of all cases. But in long-term care facilities, 45% of the deaths came from there, from coronavirus. That's massively skewed. Think about it, like almost half of the people who died from coronavirus in the entire country, only 14% of the patients were in these long-term care facilities. And nearly half of them, of all deaths of coronavirus in the country, died. 45%. And in light of all this, Andrew Cuomo goes on Chris Cuomo's show, and this is what happens.
Me having you on the show is an unusual thing. We've never really done it, but this was an unusual time, and there were unusual needs. And you stepped up in an unusual way that really was created by a vacuum of power on the federal level. And you're not the only one. There were other governors. You've been very good and collaborative with Hogan down in Maryland and Whitmer and DeWine and the ones up in the Northeast region. But these unusual times have demonstrated some unusual characteristics in people. And of course, I won't always be able to keep having you on the show. It'll never be seen as fair in people's eyes, and we both get that, and that's okay. You got plenty of people to talk to. But I want you to know that, June's a big month for us, right? We got Mom and Pop's anniversary on the 5th. We got Pop's birthday on the 15th. And this is what he always wanted. He was proud when you became governor because of what he knew you'd do. Remember that whole talk he gave us about, I'm not proud, I don't believe in pride, pride's deadly sin, and blah, all that. What he wanted to see is what you'd do with the opportunity. And everything that he ever said mattered to him about public service is what you demonstrated right here and right now during this period when your state needed it most. And I hear it all the time. Not everybody likes you. Not everybody likes me. Everybody seems to like Pop now. That's the benefit of being out for a while, maybe gone. I just hope you recognize what even I'm able to recognize, being spawned from the same wolf pack. I hope you are able to appreciate what you did in your state and what it means for the rest of the country now, and what it will always mean to those who love and care about you the most. I'm wowed by what you did, and more importantly, I'm wowed by how you did it. This was very hard. I know it's not over, but obviously I love you as a brother. Obviously I'll never be objective. Obviously I think you're the best politician in the country. But I hope you feel good about what you did for your people, because I know they appreciate it. Nothing's perfect. You'll have your critics.
Thank you.
But I've never seen anything like what you did, and that's why I'm so happy to have had you on the show, and I hope you know that.
Yeah. Look, we're not big on sweet talk, but
That was
what
pretty
Dad
sweet.
was all about was making a difference. That was sweet.
You made a
I
difference.
wonder who wrote it. What Dad was all about. Well, you just stole my line. What Dad was all about was making a difference. And he would say, who cares what they say, right? He lost his last election. People forget that. Who cares what they say? It's what you know. It's what you did is right. What I did here was right. And whatever, was a political no-win. As you said from day one, you have people on both sides, and you couldn't make anybody happy. So you just do what's right. I did what was right. I'm comfortable with what I did. I think the facts bear it out. I think the numbers bear it out. I think we saved tens of thousands of lives. But I did what was right. And you do what is right. You tell the truth. You get up every night, and you tell the truth, whether they like it or not. This is the truth the way you see it. And that's all you can do. So I hope he'd be proud of me. He talked to me a lot through this, by the way. 111 days. I did a briefing every day. I couldn't sleep at night. I'd close my eyes, and I would say, what would Pop say? And he spoke to me, and he helped me tremendously to get through it. But what you do is the same thing. You're doing the right thing, and that's all we can do. Love you. Go to work.
I love you very much. I appreciate you being on. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, brother.
Okay, so you obviously see the type of fawning over that is happening. Obviously, Andrew and Chris are brothers, and I don't fault Chris fawning over his brother. I can tell you, if I ever had my brother or my two sisters on whatever show I ended up having, obviously it'd be a different story. I wouldn't be interviewing them like they are a public official. I'd probably be talking to them like they were my brother or sister. So you can imagine that Chris Cuomo using his airtime to essentially have a conversation with his brother when he simply could just focus his time on actually getting down to the bottom of how public officials are handling or containing the spread of coronavirus, by interviewing someone he's not related to. You can see how this is obviously pretty gross, and it's been rightly called out. I haven't had, obviously, the time to address it myself, but I've always thought that if my brother, who's 3 years older than me, if he ever ran for office, we would joke that I would interview him, but we all know very well that that can never happen because of the conflict of interest of simply being related. And I'm surprised that this went on for so long, considering that we're now at the end of June, and he started having his brother on uh, basically in the middle of March. And I don't recall if it was every night, but it certainly sounded like it was once a week. And I think it's a kind of a disservice to the people who are looking for leadership and are left with simply sibling banter. And look, I thought it was funny at first. I thought it was really funny that the two were actually dunking on each other live on air about, calling mom and like, I'm mom's favorite. And that you were basically a hooligan when you were growing up, and like, I was the good kid. That's funny, but it's not worth the airtime after so long. It got old. And unfortunately, it was a joke that ran too stale, much like the list. I oftentimes think about the list and how long I could keep that going. And to be honest, I probably will retire that as soon as the election ends, because it is my hope that people will calm down a bit, and I can just get back to just my normal routine and not be beholden to the list and Twitter. Maybe I could take a break and I don't know, delete my account. I'm sure a lot of people would like that. Look, but despite the fact that New York seems to have their coronavirus their cases and their deaths under control, they're certainly below 1,000 per day. Other states are obviously having it worse. You're looking at Texas, you're looking at Florida, you're looking at Arizona, even California. If we look at California in particular, just today, the Los Angeles Times reported that the latest surge in coronavirus cases began around Memorial Day. And if you remember, this is around the time that businesses started reopening. People were getting together for day trips to the beach. They were going to, Memorial Day weekend barbecues and gatherings. You have Father's Day gatherings in June. But and also, and I can't stress this enough, we had these massive protests in Los Angeles. We had it throughout the country: Minneapolis, New York, DC. Like no city was really. There were very few cities in which protests weren't happening. Houston is another place. I believe Miami. And these hot spots. And those protests in particular in California seem to have contributed probably in a large part to the surge that we're seeing in coronavirus. And despite the fact that people, probably a wide majority or a significant majority of protesters were wearing masks, not everyone was careful. It's not like a mask can 100% stop anyone from getting coronavirus or contracting it. And it looks like people weren't social distancing enough, and they weren't taking the necessary precautions. I'm sure people were touching each other, shaking hands, hugging, what have you. Exchanging bottles of water, or even from say things like tear gas, or just the humidity in the air, the water molecules in the air, contributing to the spread of coronavirus. And I'm worried we haven't seen the end of it. Cases are probably only going to continue to go up, deaths with it. Just on June 27th, the California Department of Health reported 4,000 coronavirus hospitalizations, more than 4,000 coronavirus hospitalizations, and just a little over 1,000 being in the ICU. And they haven't seen this type of hospitalization rate go up this fast since early April. Obviously disheartening. You kind of had to expect something like this would happen. given the fact that protests were happening widespread throughout the country. And while we may not have seen anything in New York, we've certainly seen things in California, in Texas, in Florida, and some of these states are now about to deal with the worst brunt of it, and just got to pray for them. Arizona is another state in which, say, they're having difficulties with contact tracing. And for those who aren't familiar with contact tracing, that's simply keeping track of an individual who tested positive for coronavirus, and then everybody they ever met with and talked to, or they got close to, say, family members, friends, coworkers, people at, say, restaurants, what have you. It could have exposed hundreds of people, creating another outbreak. And Arizona is having difficulty with contact tracing, and this is probably a microcosm of what's happening throughout the country. Is that it's really difficult to contact trace when you don't have enough people to staff to follow those people. That's an issue that Arizona is having. But also, people aren't cooperating. They're not answering the phone to contact tracers to basically check in, especially if they've tested positive for coronavirus. And the amount of days that are factored in. You're looking at anywhere between 2 to 5 days of someone getting tested, getting the results, and then realizing that in those 2 to 5 days, they have exposed, say, hundreds to maybe even thousands of people to coronavirus. And another interesting point about all this is that in the beginning of all of this, people over the age of 50 were the ones who are more likely to get diagnosed with coronavirus. Now it's people between the ages of 18 and 49, primarily under the age of 35. I'm 32. I haven't contracted coronavirus yet. It's possible I could have already had it and been asymptomatic. I don't know. I never got tested. But I've been basically hunkered down in my home, and the only times I've gone out, I've been to the store wearing a mask, and sometimes I've golfed with my dad and brother. So when it comes to coronavirus, just remain vigilant. And look, even Sean Hannity is saying to wear a mask, and we should probably do that. It would help if obviously there wasn't as much misinformation or disinformation out there. You're seeing a lot of pushback from people on both sides about who to trust, and it sounds like obviously the politicization of public health has happened, from public health officials essentially approving the protests on racism, saying that racism is a public health crisis, to say people basically saying that wearing a mask is like in defiance of God, or it's an act of devil worship. Like, we've seen it all. It's just it's really, I mean, essentially, you gotta laugh at some of this stuff. Just protect yourself, protect your family. That's all you gotta do. After we've had all these protests throughout the country and continuing protests to essentially demand more police accountability following the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there's now been basically a cultural backlash. And it's been a weird backlash, not really coming from the right, but coming from the left. And you're seeing cancel culture essentially it's taking on a life of its own. And we're seeing a lot of Hollywood liberals and production companies essentially trying to make amends for the sins of the past that were racially insensitive. And I'm looking at things like blackface. Now, blackface was always a controversial thing. It's never been appropriate. But even in a way to mock blackface, that's now being canceled. So say, for example, you have Jimmy Kimmel playing Oprah Winfrey and Karl Malone. And that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s on The Man Show. obviously Jimmy Kimmel's not mocking blackface. He's actually in blackface playing characters. He's apologized for that. He's also apologized for allegedly using the N word in the comedy sketch while trying to imitate Snoop Dogg. You have Jimmy Fallon playing Chris Rock, and he was basically in the full, full blackface as well. And that was when he was on SNL in the late 90s, early 2000s. 30 Rock, head writer Tina Fey, pulling 4 episodes that included blackface from NBC streaming, or essentially requesting that it be pulled because of the use of blackface. I haven't seen any. I've only seen like 1 season of 30 Rock, and I can't tell you if I ever came across the blackface episodes, but essentially those were pulled. Then you have Community, essentially pulling their episode on Dungeons and Dragons that included, I believe, Ken Jeong, the Asian actor and comedian, for dressing up in blackface but as an elf. Then The Office, they have blackface. Scrubs, The Golden Girls, and it's only a matter of time before they get Tropic Thunder, which came out in 2008. Hilarious film, and kind of a commentary on just how Hollywood operates as a whole. In fact, it's a very smart social commentary on how Hollywood operates, because rather than going and hiring a black actor, they hire an actor played by Robert Downey Jr., who's Australian, and gets surgery to essentially look and appear black. I mean, like, people obviously can tell the difference between, certain uses of blackface, like a Jimmy Kimmel or a Jimmy Fallon, to the blackface used by, say, Robert Downey Jr. But obviously, because he's in blackface, it's only a matter of time before that movie gets pulled from streaming and is outright canceled. But then it goes a step further than that. And this happens to do with like the war on cartoons. So like, for example, The Simpsons, you have Hank Azaria leaving the character of Apu. This happened months ago, obviously, before the George Floyd protests, but it's just part of a string of, generally speaking, white actors and actresses leaving roles where they're portraying cartoons of color. You have Jenny Slate stepping away from her character in Big Mouth, who's like a biracial, half Jewish, half black girl by the name of Missy Foreman Greenwald. And then in Central Park, you have Kristen Bell stepping away from her mixed race character. In Family Guy, Mike Henry, the guy who voices Cleveland Brown, he's leaving that character. BoJack Horseman, Allison Brie, voicing an Asian character, Diane Huen, she's leaving that character. And that's not exactly blackface, but it is cultural appropriation. I mean, it's only a matter of time, really, before all of these slots are filled by just Scarlett Johansson and Scarlett Johansson alone. She's going to play every single character of color. And, Hollywood's going to complain. People will complain, but, like, she's just going to keep going on her merry way. Then you have things like changing Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's, which I get it. Those were based on, like, stereotypical depictions of black people used for, essentially selling a product, maple syrup, rice, and while Aunt Jemima, apparently she got profits, it's reported that she didn't get much. And then Dungeons and Dragons moving on from like Community to replacing the evil races like the orcs and the dark elves. You have bands changing their names. Lady Antebellum changing their name to Lady A. You have the Dixie Chicks changing their name to just the Chicks. And then slaves changing their name to, I don't know, Liberators. I actually don't know what name they changed theirs to. You have Oregon and Oregon State, 2 universities that play an annual football game in college football, changing their name of the nickname of their game from the Civil War, as if the Civil War only applies to the American Civil War that was fought over slavery. Seems a little much. Then you have Princeton University changing the name of one of its buildings from Woodrow Wilson the president of the United States over 100 years ago, because of his racist thinking and policies. Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, today is considered one of the most racist presidents and probably one of the worst presidents, despite the fact that he was overseeing the League of Nations, the defeat of the Central Powers in World War One. Of course, you can make a lot of criticisms about the League of Nations and the penalties that they essentially put on Germany, that created a fascist despot, dictator, and Adolf Hitler, and the sort of global agreements and pacts that sort of led to this neoliberal agenda that we now see today, in which you have this competing ideologies of globalism and national populism, where Trump represents the national populism, and basically everybody else is a globalist. While beyond that, you have other Ivy League schools that are now being pressured to change their names, from Yale and Brown and Columbia. Yale and Brown, who are, I guess, slave-owning families or slave-owning people. Columbia, which I imagine is named after Christopher Columbus. And then you have, obviously, Washington, D.C., which, while pushing for statehood, is looking to change its name to Washington, D.C., as the D.C., not District of Columbia, but D.C. Douglas Commonwealth, named after Frederick Douglass, one of the most famous black abolitionists and authors and writers. Now, Washington, D.C. in the House, they approved a measure for D.C. statehood. It's obviously going to stall in the Senate. It's never going to happen. It's never going to get to the president's desk. And it's kind of crazy that even just naming it Washington Douglas Commonwealth, it's almost like Washington, who was a slave owner, George Washington, and Douglas, Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist. It's like they cancel each other out. So all you're left with is just Commonwealth. It's kind of silly, but okay. But I mean, at the end of the day, this is all about protecting their brands. It may very well end up that there are benefits to it. You might see diversification of many writing rooms and newsrooms, and also some production studios. But it almost seems like these brands are more inclined to not be ostracized or canceled than they are to do the right thing. And it's sad because all of that coverage has completely eclipsed police reform, which was the original goal that these protests set out to do. Of course, a lot of these protests have set out to essentially take down statues of Confederate monuments and Confederate generals, and some have been torn down. But they've also moved to essentially slave owners, and slave owners include a lot of the founding fathers. You have George Washington, his statue being torn down in Portland, Oregon. You have Ulysses S. Grant, who, while was a slave owner, was the general of the Union Army that helped defeat. He was instrumental in defeating the Confederacy and obviously ending the institution of slavery with it. And as a result, then became president and helped smash the Ku Klux Klan. He owned a slave before the Emancipation Proclamation, and he freed the slave beforehand, before the Emancipation Proclamation. And there are obviously competing reasons about why he did it. One was for economic reasons. One was because he thought it was the right thing to do, or he saw that saw writing on the wall that slavery was about to end, and that he should basically act now. Whatever the case may be, he was obviously instrumental in helping end the institution of slavery for good, like forever. Obviously, there's modern day slavery today, but not in the similar way that we see it from the pre-Civil War era. But the coverage has obviously been skewed more towards this cancel culture because it's sensationalist and it's around entertainment, and everybody enjoys these pieces of art and entertainment. But we've basically missed the boat on Democrats and Republicans dropping the ball here and not coming up with some level of police reform legislation. And it seems like because it's an election year, both sides gave in to political pressure internally. And, you know, you can make the case that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell wasn't bipartisan enough, that it was only Republicans who drafted the Senate bill. And it ended up getting blocked by Democrats. And then you can make the case that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's rhetoric by accusing Republicans of trying to get away with the murder of George Floyd, that nothing was done. You can say that was a pretty contributing factor. Both sides are to blame here. It's political gridlock in Washington as usual. Tim Scott's bill, the Republican senator from South Carolina, he wanted to ban or limit no-knock search warrants, which was the cause, is what led to Breonna Taylor's death in Louisville, Kentucky. But after, going through the procedures, that got watered down to simply just calling on the Department of Justice to collect data on no-knock search warrants. So it wouldn't have solved the problem either way. Pelosi's bill, on the other hand, that included a ban on chokeholds and no-knock search warrants. It limited qualified immunity, which is essentially the immunity that police officers have when doing their job, and essentially it protects them from being held liable from lawsuits for doing their job. If any lawsuits were to happen, they make it to the police department. They wouldn't make it to the officer in particular. No agreement could be made on chokeholds, though. And that's kind of what spawned this whole Pelosi talk about Republicans are trying to get away with the murder of George Floyd. In the end of the day, politics kind of poisons the entire well here. You don't get police reform, and as a result, you get a change of the culture. And despite, say the 1994 crime bill that Joe Biden he authored and got passed in the Clinton administration, none of it will, I doubt Biden will take a similar approach this time around, considering that it's now almost 25 years later, almost 26 years later, and wokeism essentially reigns supreme. It's its own orthodoxy, and there's no salvation, there's no reward. It's only punishment, and punishment is basically canceling and ostracizing people. It's all about it doesn't reward people for ideological purity. It simply filters out ideological impurity. It filters out people's sins, their mistakes that they made in the past. People aren't allowed to progress from having, say, outdated or inappropriate opinions about certain things. It's not even like doing inappropriate actions. Say, like, for example, Chris D'Elia, who automatically doesn't have any say in any matter because it seemed like he was very predatory towards, say, young girls, underage girls, trying to groom them. And that's obviously abhorrent, and he should be condemned for it. But in certain things that are similar, that are not, obviously these things are harmful, but only in the lens of, say, where we are right now as a society. Back then, no one made us think of it. And if people did these controversial things back then, we as a society didn't rightly call it out because for some reason that was still acceptable to at least a majority of the crowd. Obviously times have changed, and you're seeing that people nowadays aren't allowed to have opinions that they once held, even if they don't hold them anymore. And what I mean by that is people aren't allowed to evolve and change their mind. And I think we as a country need to remember that people are constantly changing. We're constantly evolving our view of the world, our view of perspective on and everything from politics, religion, how we should, treat each other. And it's been a weird but rude awakening. As a tangent to all of these protests, we have what's going on in CHOP, the Capitol Hill Occupy protest in Seattle. On Monday, a 16-year-old boy was killed and a 14-year-old was injured in a shooting. It was the fourth shooting in 9 days, and the fourth shooting in 10 days. And Mayor Jenny Durkan, the Seattle mayor, who, by the way, had the opportunity to break up these protests about a month or so ago. In these protests, this CHOP was centered around the East Precinct of the Seattle Police Department. The precinct was completely abandoned, and initially was established as CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. But the fact that she diminished the impact that this could have had on her city, or even other cities for that matter, by dismissing it as a summer of love. Now she's got 2 fatal shootings on her hands, and the last one, the first one being Lorenzo Anderson, a 19-year-old who was shot and killed at the edge of the protest area. I don't know what you can say to this. I mean, she's got blood on her hands, and obviously what she's doing is wrong, and there's zero accountability on her part, and it sounds like the people don't care about it. It's mind-boggling, really. Like, where, if this happened in a city where a Republican was mayor, people would be calling on that mayor to resign on a national level. Like, people are calling, like, Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, to resign for his handling of coronavirus, and he had things pretty well maintained until you had essentially people going out and about and protesting, people going to beaches. I mean, like, the beaches issue wasn't even that big. Things got really bad after the protests started happening. And obviously, correlation doesn't equal causation. We don't know for certain exactly where all of these outbreaks are happening in Florida, but it seems like people really want Ron DeSantis to go, and he arguably has done a better job of handling coronavirus than, say, Andrew Cuomo. In any event, instead of the focus being on Mayor Jenny Durkan and having a couple of deaths of 2 teenagers on her hands, all of this focus is on the St. Louis couple, who Mark and Patricia McCloskey. And they're under fire for essentially brandishing their firearms on their private property. And protesters essentially broke into a private street that was gated, and they kept essentially telling them that this is private property, you need to get out. Now, for the record, their trigger discipline was horrible. Mark McCloskey didn't have the safety on. The safety was off. And then Patricia McCloskey looks like she's never held a handgun before, had her finger essentially resting right on the trigger. That's how you get someone killed or badly wounded. And she was pointing that thing everywhere. It's like she's thinking she's some sort of gangbanger. But be that as it may, it was their private property. They were well within their right to defend it. And the fact that they brandished their firearms, things de-escalated. Those protesters left. And you could imagine that if they came out of their homes without any firearms, in spite of whatever gun safety class they didn't take, you can imagine that they could have experienced a break-in. And while people were saying that they are peaceful protesters, why'd they break into a private street? What are they trying to get across? they get in the face of these people, these wealthy elite in St. Louis, are they gonna really change any minds? Especially if they're like protesting right outside their door. I mean, the answer is obviously no. You're not going to change any minds by doing that. And you're naive if you think that you are going to change any minds by doing that. Of course, you got to engage the people who don't agree with you, but the McCloskeys said that they support the protests. They said outright, basically, Black Lives Matter, and they are simply protecting their private property. And it's the same thing that a storefront owner would do. Do they all of a sudden, if it's say like a business owner of color, if they were black, if they were Arab, if they were Sikh, if they were Asian, like the rooftop Koreans in the L.A. riots in '92, are they like trying to stop the movement and not hold police accountable for their actions, particularly when it comes to members of the black community? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that their livelihoods are at stake, and they know that there are bad faith actors everywhere, and they hide amongst them. They hide amongst these peaceful protesters. I mean, we saw it with these Boogaloo boys in Oakland. Two guys, one of which shot and killed a federal law enforcement officer outside of a federal building, as well as wounded his colleague. And he was arrested and tried with murder. And essentially, their reasoning was that they wanted to go kill cops and hide amongst these peaceful protesters. That doesn't mean that members of Black Lives Matter or these protests were actually trying to kill cops, but you can imagine that it is a pretty good cloak to sort of hide amongst these protesters and then say open fire on a police officer or an innocent bystander, or beat the shit out of a business owner, or loot their business. I mean, it's not hard to think about these things happening. Of course, people's lives matter. Black lives matter. That is like, when people say all lives matter, they're just being antagonistic dicks. And I don't think they actually believe. I think there is a contingent within this all lives matter movement who believe that, yes, of course, black lives do matter, but they're saying all lives matter because they don't want they don't want to be like become a tool of politicization. So you see like Mike Pence saying all lives matter. Like, come on, man. It's just too much, man. Man, I think I got everything I needed to say. This has been an episode I was working on quite a bit, and if you like what you listen to, obviously leave a review. I'm on iTunes, Spotify. Hit that 5-star rating, leave a comment. YouTube, subscribe to the channel. I'm also on Patreon if you want to send a couple bucks my way. And Habibis, I'll see you next time. Have a great 4th of July weekend. Hopefully we can come back a little bit refreshed. And maybe these last 4 months before the election won't be so bad. Who knows? But they'll probably get worse. All right, Habibis. Peace.